Do you know, it's nigh on nearly 40 years since I last laid in this little triangular field. 40 years! That's incredible. It's 2/3 of my life ago. It has changed, but you'd expect it to change in 40 years. Everything's grown, including me. This is a small field just outside Kirklington. In fact, it's just off the disused railway that runs to Southall, the Southall Trail. So you're asking, what's the daft sod doing lying in a field? Well, I'm reminiscing actually of times gone by and of a hobby gone by that I would like to get into again. I thought I'd pop here, back to this little tiny field, this little triangular field, see if it still fits me. It does, just about. Boy, did we spend some hours here. Now the we part that I mentioned refers to my lifelong friendship with Gary Wilson. Gary's unfortunately no longer with us, would probably still be observing to this day, because observing, in fact meteor observing, was the reason that we spent so many hours in this field on many dark, clear and mostly moonless nights. It was a friendship that had developed since the early years of our schooling together at Arnold Hill Comprehensive School, which apparently, like all the others, is now an academy. So there, it's posh, apparently. But it was where our friendship grew. We exchanged hobbies. I became interested in Gary's hobbies and interest involving insects, mostly butterflies and moths, and in return Gary became interested in my primary hobby of astronomy. Over the years we quickly developed a greater interest in meteor astronomy, which is a lesser known aspect of astronomy. And at the time, during the 1980s, when we were at our peak, so to speak, of observing, there were only a handful of people in the UK doing meteor observing, and it was just prior to and at the very start of the internet. Boy, if we'd had today's technology and endless possibilities with technology, we wouldn't have had to have left the house, such as the advances that there are in astronomy and the internet nowadays. But for us, we used to come out here. It was in the sort of mid-1980s. Our first observing used to be done at each other's houses. Then we eventually got mobile and observed in a field tucked away at Lamley. We then started to come more out to here, and this became our main site, before ultimately going to other sites when this one became just a little bit too more accessible to dubious members of the public. There's a public car park here, and so it was always a bit hit and miss as to whether you could leave your car or not, but it was never too far away. But this little field used to be a little grass field. It was grazed then, and it's certainly not been grazed for a couple of years here by the looks of it. But everything has just grown up enormously in 40 years, like you'd expect, including me. Now, from where we used to lie on the two camp beds here, this was our view, although the trees that you can see, those alders, they were nowhere near this size. I don't know whether I've got a photo somewhere that they're on, but when we used to observe here, they were probably no more than the height of the hawthorns that you can see on the right of the picture. There is a dike that runs down underneath where those trees are, and the disused railway line runs left of where I'm stood now. It's hard to imagine what, the observing that we did here, and how much of the sky has now become obscured. The hedgerow here behind us has now grown dramatically. It was just a small hedge, and it gave us a bit of protection. That's why we often used to put the camp beds quite close to it. It blocked out any wind. It's very different now, my lad. Well, certainly on a cold October or November night, we weren't looking for these things. This is a good example of how my hobbies and interests have changed, and while I do strongly have an interest in nature observing, at the time, 40 years ago, I never dreamt that I would have an interest in this. This is a harvestman. This is Dicranopalpus ramosus. More than likely this species, and not Dicranopalpus caudatus. This is just on a fence post here. I thought that little tiny spider was going to make it move and make a run for it, but it hasn't. But this is a species, it's an invasive species, been in the country years now, and I do believe that it is into Scotland. Originally it was a Mediterranean species. How many Mediterranean species are now common in the UK? Such is the change in fortunes. Not only have I changed hobbies and interests, and so the UK's fauna and Nottinghamshire's fauna has changed greatly in that time too. And that change of interest obviously includes changes within an interest, even if that interest is lifelong, or pretty much lifelong. And that's the interest that I've always had since secondary school and since meeting Gary in Lepidoptera. Primarily, that interest started as breeding butterflies and moths. But then over the years, that interest changed and developed. It died off to a certain extent when birds took over, but now birds have gone and it's back to the Lepidoptera, but also pretty much all the orders of insects. Never did I think that I'd also be looking not only for harvestmen, but for the leaf mines of Stigmella acerus. Actually, I've never seen so many examples of Stigmella acerus at any of the sites where I've recorded it so far. It's all over the place here. This is the field just adjacent to the little field that I'm featuring here. And this is pretty much how it used to be when Gary and myself used to set up our equipment. If you could call it equipment, it was just 2 camp beds, a couple of sleeping bags and a survival bag each, a clock, and tape recorders. Remember them, children? You've probably never heard of them. Yeah. Long ago were the days where you used to have to get 4 HP11 batteries or whatever they were, and then you'd go out and have to get some cassette tapes. TDK cassette C90s, can you remember them? Well, if you can still get them. But this was pretty much how the field looked, on the field that we used to observe in. It was cut or grazed. I can't ever remember us turning up here and there was cattle or anything in it. but the hedge would have been that kind of size. Very different now. And here's the old railway line. It's a long line. You can sort of walk this or cycle it all the way from Southall right up to as far as Farnsfield, and then you can continue round and it will take you ultimately to Bilsthorpe. Largely always used as a mineral line, but I do seem to recollect that at one time when it first opened there was a passenger service here, but now it's mainly people on bikes, lots of bikes, but it's a nice easy walk, but generally completely overgrown now. There are a couple of places as you walk along where you can view out across the fields, but it's surprising how this too has grown up. Now the home of redwings, songthrush and robin. Quite surprised to find hornbeam here. I don't suppose that all the planting along here was naturalised. I don't think it was, but whoever planted it, they've gone mad with dogwoods. Far too much dogwood here for me. But I've had a look for a couple of leaf mines on hornbeam. You might not be surprised to hear. And yeah, there are all leaf mines present. First of them, this is likely to be Stigmella microtheriella. Now, Stigmella microtheriella is the commonest of the stigmellas that I find on hornbeam in Nottinghamshire. There are a couple of other species that can mine and produce similar mines. The most likely other one is Stigmella flosslactella, but quite often the difference between the two is the positioning of the egg in relation to the veins on the leaf surface. That's an expected species. Just here there's another one, but not so expected. This is the blotch mine of Philonerichta esperella. It's an upper surface mine, so the leaf becomes quite contorted and tends to pucker up and forms like an envelope. I'm going to open this one up later on to see whether there's a viable pupa in that, because I don't think I've seen the adult of Esperella. So I'll put that there for a minute. Now, the more unusual record of all is this. If I get it to the right angle here. This is a feathered thorn. Quite beautiful late fly moth. It'll fly from sort of mid-October and possibly right through to well into December, depending on the weather that we get. It is still very mild here and it's peak season for this chap. The rarity is that you rarely find macro moths by day, especially rested on foliage. You can find them visually only occasionally, but yes, you can beat the hell out of a tree or a shrub and they'll drop out of the leaves, but otherwise you rarely see moths during the day. Tree trunks, quite common to find them on, but to find a moth in this situation, and it was just sat openly on top of the leaf. Has it chosen this particular coloured leaf to sit on by accident? I very much doubt it. I think this moth knew which particular leaf matched its wing coloration. You can call me fanciful if you will, but I think that the moth has chosen to sit on this yellow leaf by choice, because it knows that it's better camouflaged, and it is well camouflaged. If you was to just look at that like that, you see how well camouflaged these are from birds. But say, it's unusual, certainly in my case, to find a macro moth like this actually resting on foliage. In all, I've only been here maybe an hour now. I've sort of dragged it out because I've found a few bits, and that's largely because I've found and been looking for leaf mines. But to find this feathered thorn, it's almost like a feather in my cap, so to speak. It's a nice find, and it's the most pleasing find, because I can guarantee feathered thorn wouldn't have been recorded from anywhere within 5-10 miles probably of this place. 10 miles might be stretching it a little bit, but certainly this record will add another kilometre grid square to the maps that I host on the website. Beautiful.